Welcome back to Africa 24 English. It is always a pleasure to have you with us. For this special edition of the interview, we are joined by Mr. Chad Blackman, Minister of Economic Affairs and Investment of Barbades. And together we will discuss about the vision of one global Africa in the context of global financial architecture reform. Mr. Blackman, welcome to Africa 24 English.
Thank you.
The 31st annual meetings of Afreximbank and the 3rd Africa Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum were held under the overall theme Taking Our Destiny in Hand Economic Prosperity on the platform of Global Africa. What were the stakes for both regions in terms of infrastructure, trade, and investment?
Well, let me firstly say thank you for having me this afternoon. When you look at the outcomes of this very important third iteration of the forum, what has become very clear is that governments across the region, or both regions rather, the Caribbean and Africa, are very committed to ensuring that we work together in treating to our development prospects, as you mentioned, in infrastructure, in trade, and building out a new ecosystem for prosperity for our two regions. And why is that important? As we look around the world, there's a lot of global uncertainty in terms of energy, in terms of climate, and the question then becomes, how can we now leverage our opportunities as the Caribbean and Africa and together to be able to do that in a way that we've not been able to do historically. When you look at the issue of global finance, particularly for developing countries in the Caribbean and Africa, most of our countries are either classified as middle income or high income. What does that basically mean? Is that when you go to request or would like to have concessional finance to be able to pay for schools, roads, healthcare, you're precluded based on that classification. So the call has gone out again for the international financial system to be reformed in a way that is, one, responsive to the needs of our people and countries, and two, that takes into context and peculiarities and vulnerabilities as well. And therefore, Africa has a powerful voice of 64 countries and intends to use that voice. The Caribbean intends to do the same with its 15 member states. And therefore now, as a unified approach between the Caribbean and Africa, what has become very clear this week is that our two regions will continue to march forward in creating a new economic model of prosperity for our regions as the world continues to change in a way that we've never done before.
Well, as we talk about forecasts, in 2022, the International Trade Center published a report identifying about $1 billion in export potential between Africa and the Caribbean, indicating that by channeling investment into growth areas, Africa could increase its merchandise exports to the Caribbean by 54% in 2026. In your opinion, what are the key sectors in which investment is urgently needed?
So on the Caribbean side, I would definitely say in terms of exporting potential and the need on the African side, the areas of tourism development, so services, for example. The Caribbean has a wealth of experience in terms of the service industries. And as Africa continues to grow, and it's growing tremendously at the collective level, the Caribbean therefore has an immense opportunity to be able to go and work with our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean region in the hospitality sector, training of their persons on the ground, but also in the area of healthcare, given the expertise that we have. On the inward side, there's immense potential now for pharmaceutical development. Africa, of course, has a lot of capacity, and the Caribbean right now is also looking to build out its own capacity, working in creating a sustainable pharmaceutical industry to be able to treat to the needs of our people should there be a pandemic. And given the resources in Africa, given the expertise also as they now build out their own, that is something that we should also look to. The area of energy, the Caribbean, and particularly, for example, Barbados, has tremendous comparative advantages with respect to solar, both in terms of solar water heating and solar energy. And that, of course, is needed as we look to treat to the issue of electricity, because you can't have competitive economies if electricity is not functioning in the way that it should. And as the construction boom takes place even more in Africa, how do you want to heat your water in your house? Solar. It reduces your costs, it's efficient, and the Caribbean can help with that. So there are lots of areas that we can help to tap into. But it helps me then to go back to that earlier point, that in order to unlock all of that, instead of one country just trading with each other in the traditional way, if we have a trade bloc between the Caribbean and Africa, it allows, therefore, for seamless trade to take place. So now is the time I want to really call on governments around the world in the context of the Caribbean and Africa. So let's look at really how do we now unpack and take forward the idea of an Africa-Caribbean trade area.
But when you talk, something that triggers my mind, when we are talking about Caribbean, we are thinking about approximately 20 countries, but on the African side, we have 54 countries. Is there not a risk of imbalance when it comes to trade, for instance, with 54 different voices in Africa, 15 here in the Caribbean?
I actually say it as, on the contrary, it provides a strategic relationship for all of us, and I'll tell you why. Trade, of course, whenever there's trade, there's always a trade a surplus, or there could be a trade deficit. But everything is based on what? Demand. So on the inward side to the Caribbean, the goods will come into the Caribbean based on the demand that the Caribbean consumers are asking for. And the reverse is true going into Africa. So what we have to then do is look to see what is the need in the Caribbean, where can this be supplied from Africa? What is the need in Africa, where can this be supplied from in the Caribbean? And therefore that database that President Onrama was talking about this morning is going to be so important, because it therefore helps us to see where the opportunities and the gaps are. But equally, as we trade, we should also have matrices to help us to monitor the flows of our trade and say, okay, we have a surplus here, but perhaps there's an area there that needs that to be filled. And using the technology and data in a way that we have not done before, I think now will help us to also treat to some of the issues that you mentioned. A very good point, because oftentimes these issues can lead to dislocations and a little tensions in trade disputes, and we don't want that. But we have to use those lessons from other trade experiences to now help us to navigate that as we move forward. We can learn in a very real way to avoid those gaps.
These annual meetings aimed at proposing concrete measures to mobilize resources for Africa and the Caribbean countries' structural transformation. In your opinion, what are the sectors in which decision makers need to set up policies that will enable both Caribbean countries and African countries to enhance the trade, their trade reforms?
I would, one word, logistics, logistics, logistics. There are enough goods in Africa to trade with the Caribbean. There are enough goods from the Caribbean to trade with Africa. There are enough goods and services from inward, outward. The question is logistics. Because why? If we have X amount of, let's say, fruit coming from Togo into Barbade or St. Kitts, which ship is going to just ship X amount of volume? It needs critical mass. What's the cost? What's the timeline? And therefore, we have to now ensure that as we talk about building out these trading partnerships between the two regions, that also the private sector, and in particular the shipping industry, works hand in hand so that as we plan, there's the necessary infrastructure that can help to facilitate the demand. Because you can have demand, but if you don't have the vehicle, literally or figuratively, to drive that, you're going to have some issues. But also to how do we ensure that our ports rather, can reduce their times in terms of entering cargo. I went to Togo a couple weeks ago, and to their credit, you can clear goods within 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Now, that is the global Africa that the world is not hearing about. Those success stories, because historically, to clear a container would take up sometimes even days, but to do it in 12 minutes.
Sometimes more.
Yeah, sometimes more. And therefore, countries in Africa also now must say to the world, here's the standard, this is what you need to do. And again, as part of that global Africa, it must now see itself as an intellectual thought leader in how trade should be done.
The idea of the Africa-Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum was established as a key strategic activity to institutionalize cooperation between the private sectors of both regions and to develop their trade and investment relationships. Today, 3 years after, what major advances have been made since then, in your opinion?
Tremendous. I mean, what you've now seen, as you mentioned, in its third year, yesterday you will have seen, and today as well, a number of deals have been done between the bank and the private sector from Africa and the Caribbean and both. And why is that important? Traditionally, our people and our business sector had to traditionally rely on the global north to be able to help finance large projects. To be able for Afrexim Bank in its third year to be able to continue to be able to give tangible financing options at very, very competitive rates and over a long period of time really signals the vision that President Onrama has And therefore, I want to take this opportunity to commend the bank for its stewardship and really unlocking the true potential of trade between the Caribbean and Africa. But we have to go further. I honestly believe, and the Prime Minister has called for this, if we are to really see the unlocking of all of the areas that we want to see, there's tremendous need for banks from Africa to come into the Caribbean. The Caribbean economies are very stable, so therefore you're entering a stable environment. The return on investment opportunities are there, very well regulated. And therefore, when you look at that platform, it is therefore necessary for us to go after strategic relationships with African banks coming into the Caribbean. So I really want to take this opportunity to say to the banks on the continent, and particularly now speaking for Barbados, that Barbados really wants to work with you as a jurisdiction that is well regulated, strong banking history, to be able to come into Barbados and set up. And more broadly, if I take the opportunity as well, let us look to each other for trade. Let us look to each other for finance. Let us look to each other for infrastructural development. We have excellent infrastructure in the Caribbean. How can our engineers go into Africa and work and do some of those projects? We have excellent engineers in Africa who are doing fantastic designs and infrastructure that would blow the mind. How can they also treat to some of those opportunities that we have in the Caribbean and also treating some of the challenges too? The idea I'm making is that global Africa, and dare I say global Caribbean, must now take every moment to rethink and relook how we engage from a financial basis, from a trade basis, with the objective of ensuring that we can tick all the boxes relative to our own development needs and taking the renewed approach of a renewed Africa and a renewed Caribbean.
What are your expectations towards Afreximbank, you as representative of Barbados here?
Well, my expectations is that one, Afreximbank will continue to be the great player that it is. It is such a proud feeling to see that an African bank, an indigenous African institution, is providing the necessary finance, but not just the finance, the moral leadership, the strategic leadership, bringing our regions together, going into country after country and trying to treat to the needs of those, of our people. And I would simply say to Afreximbank, as I said, to continue, but I would also encourage other governments who are not part of the infrastructure of Afrexim to do so, to join the family, as it were. Because why? You can see now within 3 years the tangible benefits that we are deriving from this process. So kudos to them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blackman, for answering Africa 24's English questions. Ladies and gents, here comes the end of this interview, but please stay tuned to our programs.